Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Heugten. I am in the Department of Animal Science. I've been here at NC State for almost 24 years now. That's a weird thing to say for me, but it's been that long. I have enjoyed my time here very much. Before I came here, I worked in the industry for a little over 3 years with grain feed division of Continental Grain Company. So during my time here, I've worked primarily on applied research in swine. And so my goal with the research program is to provide research-based solutions to support our swine industry. And so that approach varies all the way from working with sows. Sows research has become a bigger part of the research program for me here recently. Of course, the sow is extremely important in providing our pigs and pigs with good vigor, good health status that can grow into a market pig. So the number of pigs per sow per year is definitely a big driving factor in profitability for a pork production industry. So I've been able to shift my focus a little bit more on the sow side. Also active in doing nursery research and finishing research. And just to put a plug in for the videos for over lunch from our students, you will see a lot of the work that we're doing that we are not necessarily addressing in our presentations, addressed by the students over lunch. So please make sure to look at those presentations and see what our students are doing. So part of my program being applied, I think it's very important to work with the industry. So we have done a lot of projects working with commercial partners, and at the same time also it's important to give feedback to the industry in terms of providing materials and providing information, which is part of the thing that we're doing today. Another very important part of my program is graduate student education, and it's one of my passions is to work with students and to see students being successful in the industry and being well trained and have impact. So with that, I am going to talk some on the research that we've done, and I've selected some of what I view the most impactful research that we have been able to do. And I have 3 projects here to describe for you that are different types of projects with different ingredients. So the first project is actually a project that David Rosero, who you heard from this morning, that this was part of his PhD program. And David pointed out the great working relationship we had with Henor Company. And this project basically started our collaboration with Henor Company, with Dean Boyd, and with David, then as a PhD student, and now as a Henor Company employee. And so this project was basically asking what type of fat should we feed and how much fat should we feed in lactation. And so, sows produce a lot of milk to support the litter. And so the idea was to add energy by the supplementation of fat. And the question was, in this case, AV blend versus choice white grease. Is there a quality difference in fat in how the sow responds? And how does that compare to the control? And so in this particular study, we fed a control diet with no fat, and then we fed 2%, 4%, and 6% fat of either AV blend or choice white grease. And we were most interested in litter gain and not so much sow performance. And so what we noticed that there was little impact on litter gain, but what we noticed that was interesting is we saw an increase in farrowing rate that's shown in your left-hand panel. So when you go from the control diet to 2%, 4%, and 6%, we saw an increase in farrowing rate. And also we saw a linear increase in subsequent litter size. So that was our first hint that we had something interesting going on, which we tied back to essential fatty acids. So there are two essential fatty acids that a pig and a human and other species cannot actually make. So there's linoleic acid, which is C18.2, and there's alpha-linolenic acid, which is C18.3. Those two fatty acids are very important in the production of prostaglandins, and prostaglandins we know are important in reproduction of sows. So we were speculating that these two essential fatty acids were limiting in diets for sows, which normally we actually assumed that those would be supplied in adequate quantities in a corn soybean diet. So that's why very little research actually had been done looking at essential fatty acids in pigs or in sows. So David then went ahead and he did a balance of essential fatty acid intake versus output in milk. So he calculated very simply how much linoleic acid the sow consumed and how much would go out into the milk based on how much the pig would gain. And so when he did that, and he looked at 3 different time points: early lactation, mid lactation, and the end of lactation. And when you look at the output in milk, which is the red bars, compared to the intake in the blue bars, the output in milk was actually greater than the intake. So overall, there was a negative balance of essential fatty acid, in this case linoleic acid, of 350 grams. Yet if you added lipid, you basically took care of that deficiency. So on the left-hand side, when you did not have added lipid, the sow would have to mobilize that lipid from body reserves to be able to supply those essential fatty acids. So we then followed up with 3 more studies to look at the requirement of a sow for linoleic and linolenic acid. And this slide shows a particularly linoleic acid intake. And this is a summary of those 3 studies. And it represents 84, 152, 163, and 144 sows for each of these different levels of linoleic acid. So when you look here on the left-hand side, this red line on the top, that was our highest linoleic acid level that we fed, over 150 grams per day. And you would see that the cumulative proportion of sows that were bred is greater than the extreme here in the green bar, which was no added lipid. And you can see the same on the right-hand side when it comes to farrowing rate. You see that when the high levels of linoleic acid were fed at 155 grams per day or higher, it was a better farrowing rate than those that were not receiving lipid at all. So we then decided to summarize the data as a pig-born index. And the pig-born index is the total number of pigs born per 100 weaned sows. So it takes into account the farrowing rate, and it takes into account the total pigs born. And so when you look at this graph, you can see from no added lipid or less than 100 grams per day of linoleic acid intake, we see a pretty linear response up to at least 145 grams per day of linoleic acid. So based on that, we established some requirements for linoleic acid intake, and we have the data for linolenic acid, alpha-linolenic acid as well. Alpha-linolenic acid primarily increased the number of pigs born and did not so much improve farrowing rate, but I'm not showing those data in the interest of time. This slide shows you the summary of those three trials in terms of the percentage of sows that were culled. And you can see in these darker bars here in the bottom that we see a linear decrease in the number of sows that were culled due to reproductive reasons. And again, here the optimum being between 115 and 150 grams per day of linoleic acid intake. So we did then another study here very recently with another student, Garen Shipman, who did his master's on this project and is now working at South Dakota State on his PhD. But what we did here is we did, again, supplementation of linoleic and alpha-linolenic acid through the supplementation of soybean oil. So we were comparing tallow versus soybean oil, both included at 4.1%, and that would provide about 1% or 3% linoleic acid respectively. And it also, soybean oil also contains alpha-linolenic acid, so we are also supplying alpha-linolenic acid at the same time. So when you see here, the conception rate was not much difference here with feeding the essential fatty acids, but farrowing rate was actually significantly improved when we fed essential fatty acids here, the p-value of 0.05, and the removal rate was significantly decreased. And this was feeding essential fatty acids during lactations, like the other studies that we conducted. And so we're basically verifying that supplementation of essential fatty acids in lactation improved farrowing rate and decreased removal rate. But in this case, we were also interested in what would happen if we supplemented essential fatty acids during breeding. And so we fed essential fatty acids post-breeding as well, and you can see the results of that here. So on the left-hand side, you see parity 1 and 2 sows, and on the right-hand side, you see parity 3+ sows. And what you can see here in farrowing rate, surprisingly, when we supplemented essential fatty acid, in young sows, we actually have a decrease in farrowing rate, and we have an increase in removal rate, quite opposite of what we were anticipating. In the older sows, we did not see any significant differences due to supplemental fatty acids. So what this work really shows is that supplementation in lactation was positive, but supplementation in gestation during the breeding post-weaning was actually detrimental in young parity sows. I don't have a very good explanation for that, but that is definitely something to keep in mind and perhaps evaluate in future studies. So Garen also did another study looking a little bit more at the mechanisms of why this might actually happen. And so what we did is we did a study with 33 sows, and we fed the sows either a control diet. That control diet contained 0.88% linoleic acid and 0.1% alpha-linolenic acid, which is actually relatively low. And the reasons those were low is because we used a wheat soybean meal-based diet to make sure that we had a low level in our control diet. And then we add either 3.3% linoleic acid in one treatment or 0.6% alpha-linolenic acid in another treatment. And then these sows were euthanized at 30 days of pregnancies to look at embryo survival and other items. And I'll point out the most important things that we found. So when you look at embryo survival, we see an embryo survival of almost 80% in the linoleic acid treatment compared to the other two treatments. And that is highly significant. We also see an increase in placental weight, and we see an increase in the amount of allantoic volume for sows that were fed 3.3% linoleic acid, suggesting that some of the responses that we see when we feed linoleic acid to sows might be related to early embryo survival. Now, just to give you a little bit of a picture of what this placental unit looks like, this is the picture of what it looks like. So this whole thing is a placental unit. And so these are embedded in the uterus. And you can see the embryo right here. And you can see vaguely the outline here of the amniotic membrane and the amniotic fluid. So this is the embryo. This is the amniotic fluid that the embryo is bathed in. And then this whole thing contains the allantoic fluid, which contains the waste and some of the nutrients for the embryo. And so we see that the size of this and the volume of the allantoic fluid is bigger. We see the embryo is bigger as well when linoleic acid is supplemented. So then the application of that is we recommended to feed at least 125 grams per day of linoleic acid and over 10 grams per day of linolenic acid. But the question is, should we feed the average sow or should we feed the sow that are challenged in terms of their intake? And so in this case, this is an all or nothing response. So the sows either get pregnant or they don't get pregnant. So I would argue that you might want to feed sows on the lower end of the spectrum. So some sows on average eat 5.5 kilos per day, so about 12 pounds per day. But there are sows that are challenged that might only eat 2.5, 3.5 kilos per day. And so if we want to also focus on those sows and we want to supply, let's say, 100 grams per day of linoleic acid, we need to put 3.3% soybean oil in the diet to reach that. If we want to feed the average sow and they eat about, let's say, 5 kilograms per day, then that diet only needs to contain 2.1% of linoleic acid. So depending on what the variation is and which sows you want to target, knowing this distribution on feed intake will allow you to calculate what the intake of, what the inclusion of soybean oil needs to be to reach the amount of linoleic acid that you want to target. And that, of course, is also depending on cost. So the next thing that I want to talk about a little bit, we have an interest in lauric acid as well. Lauric acid is a fatty acid that is a C12. So it's a relatively short chain fatty acid that is preferentially oxidized. So it provides energy to the animal. And in this case, we're interested very much so in sows, although we haven't done any research in sows yet. And lauric acid is also an antimicrobial. And we've done some work with nursery pigs to look at the black soldier fly larvae and the oil derived from those larvae. And that oil is very high in lauric acid, contains about 37% lauric acid. And so in our studies with these black soldier flies, we did a study with 192 pigs, and then we increased the level of black soldier fly larva oil, replacing corn oil, up to 6%. And what you can see in the graph here on the right-hand side, at 4 and 6%, we are significantly increasing the body weight of those pigs, of those nursery pigs, at the end of a 40-day nursery period. And that's a difference of 1 kilograms in body weight after 4 days in the nursery, or about 2.2 pounds. So I think there's some promise there. Lauric acid, we have some preliminary data. Lauric acid is actually transferred into the milk, and it is actually transferred into the piglets suckling that milk. We have shown increases in lauric acid content of the mucosa of the intestinal tract of suckling piglets when sows were fed diets that were contain higher levels of lauric acid. So there's some interest there. The other thing we're interested in is fiber. And there's a lot of research has been done in fiber, but we're really interested in fiber right around the transition period, with the transition period being defined as right around the farrowing process. And so we have a lot of things happening to the sow. There's a lot of growth of the pregnancy. There's increase in energy requirements. There's a switch of anabolic to catabolic metabolism. There's a lot of impact on the piglets. We have a lot of stillbirth, challenges with survival, crushing, starvation, low energy supplies that we can look at in terms of fiber supplementation. So what we're interested in is, can we use fiber to improve the farrowing process and thereby improve the vigor of the pigs and reduce the number of stillborns of pigs? And our hypothesis there is twofold. Fiber provides a more constant energy supply to the sow, and fiber reduces constipation and also improves behavior and potentially colostrum. So we're interested to looking at what type of fiber, whether it's soluble or insoluble, fermentable or non-fermentable, and how does that impact sow reproductive performance. And just to show you a video here, we're interested in, the birthing process. And we have cameras set up in collaboration with Hanor Company to look at the birth process of pigs. This one is in black and white because this is actually night vision. And I thought this would be a really good one to show because we can do daytime measuring, nighttime measuring, look at the vigor of the pig. You can see that piglet is very active right after it's born. We can time when it's born, and we can time and we can keep track of the birthing process, the total amount when it's born, and all those kind of things. And you know, with Dr. Leno talking earlier, we can probably find some algorithms to automate that, to look at the birthing process, how that relates to fiber and how that relates to the vigor and the survival of the piglet. With that, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.